When I bring up the idea that, I'm really concerned that he is dying, that his time is very limited, I have absolutely heard verbatim, but he's in his 30s and they always want to continue. Or he's in his 30s and, he can still tolerate more treatments. There's more treatments to offer. There's a clinical trial. There's something else. The assumption is younger people want to fight. They want every treatment possible.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. My guest is writer and physician, Dr. Sunita Puri. She's paying her third visit to the podcast. Sunita is a palliative care doctor who writes frequently about how to improve, basically everything having to do with the end of life, how we care for the dying, how we talk about dying, even how we define death. She was on a little over a year ago talking about the hidden harms of CPR, which she wrote about for The New Yorker. And Sunita is back to talk about two articles she published this summer. One in The Atlantic about how doctors deal with terminal illness in younger patients, and we're seeing an increase in cancers in people in their 20s and 30s, and another in the Wall Street Journal about dying at home. Now, we've been taught to assume that a good death means dying at home, or at least not in a hospital. But Sunita points out that this can be better in theory than in practice, and she's going to talk here about why that is. She is the author of the memoir, That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour, and has led palliative care teams at the University of Massachusetts Chan School of Medicine and the Keck Hospital and Norris Cancer Center at the University of Southern California. This is a premium episode, which means if you are not yet a paying subscriber, you're going to get a little taste, and then you're going to want to become a paying subscriber to hear the rest. Sunita is always wonderful. I know you're going to really appreciate this conversation, so enjoy. Sunita Puri, welcome back to The Unspeakable.
Thank you so much for having me back, Meghan. I'm really excited to talk to you.
So you were here almost exactly a year ago, I realized, talking about your work as a palliative care physician, and in particular, an article that you wrote for The New Yorker about CPR and all that we don't understand about that. We can maybe revisit that topic briefly later in this conversation, but I brought you back to talk about, among other things, two recent articles that you have published. One in The Atlantic and one in the Wall Street Journal. They both touch on subjects that people don't really think that much about. And let's just get into it. The Wall Street Journal article is about dying at home, which everyone thinks they want to do. And the Atlantic piece is about this phenomenon of younger patients getting terminal cancers. This is really uplifting stuff, Sunita. So thank you.
Everything I write is a beach read.
The piece in The Atlantic talks about something that I think we really have not thought about much at all as a culture. And that has to do with the way physicians deal with terminally ill patients differently according to how old they are. And there may be some things that are not surprising, maybe in terms of like fighting harder or not giving up if a patient is younger. But you bring up a really important angle, which is that approach can actually lessen the quality of life of some of these younger patients. So talk about this.
Yeah, so this is an issue that I started to observe even when I was still in my training. I remember having, and I wrote about this in my book, a young patient in her 30s who was suffering from really the final complications of a very rare blood cancer. And she was in the ICU on a ventilator, on dialysis, on medicines to keep her blood pressure afloat, and she was fully awake. And that, plus the fact that she was young, caused a tremendous amount of understandable distress, not only for her family, but for the medical team. And what I observed in that case was, as we were talking about how to proceed, how to engage her in getting a sense of her wishes when she was heavily medicated but still awake, and how to guide the family when they really didn't know her wishes. And when I teach how to talk with families to my trainees, I talk about two things: the text and the subtext of a conversation, what is said and what's beneath the words. And the current running beneath everyone's words was, this person is in her 30s. Therefore, we can try X, Y, and Z therapies because her body is young and she's been able to handle toxicity before. And I just remember being in meetings where I wanted to say, and I was still in my training, so I couldn't say it, but she may be in her 30s, but her organs are acting like she's in her 90s. And so, how do we balance that? How do we step away from our own expectations for her life and for her death in order to make room for what is right and what she might want? And so the kind of almost reverse age bias that we inflict on younger patients is something I've observed for years. And I think in light of research that shows now that, for example, millennials born in the 1990s are at way higher risk for developing rectal cancer, colorectal cancers, compared to people born in the 1950s. And given that that is a trend that's been emerging for some time, this question of what is the subtext and what are the assumptions that we as physicians and other healthcare providers, and honestly families, what are the assumptions we make about what a young person can handle, what they're ready to hear, what they want for their lives, and how are those assumptions getting in the way of treating young patients and hearing what they want, because those things are essential to caring for somebody with a serious cancer. And we don't do it when people are younger. We delay it because we think that's the right thing to do. We treat them with terribly toxic treatments that we wouldn't offer to older patients because we think that's the right thing to do. And we think they haven't lived a full life. And that, to me, is one of the biggest issues thrumming beneath these conversations. Is they need more time with their child. They need to see their child grow up. They need to do X, Y, and Z, and they're being deprived of that chance. And that's all true. And it's very human. I really want to emphasize this. Very human to have hesitation and deeply emotional responses to caring for a younger patient. But we need to recognize the boundary between our distress and theirs.
Right. So let's go back to this patient in the ICU that you just described. I mean, it's just a horrifying situation, that the sort of cascade of symptoms and treatments to be on a ventilator and dialysis and in the ICU and awake.
Yep.
Did they think that she was going to get better? Like, what was the best case scenario outcome in that situation?
So I think there was no best case scenario. I mean, I think the best case scenario we came to see was liberating her from the ventilator and allowing her to die peacefully with support and comfort, because part of what ended up happening was, again, a horrifying end stage complication of her cancer was she started to develop what we called an ascending paralysis. So suddenly she couldn't move her legs. And then it spread up to her torso, and then it spread up to her arms. And it was only a matter of time before it would spread even further. And so once we saw that, there was really nothing that we could do to reverse it. I believe that all of the complications she was suffering that made her require 3 types of life support, I did not think that any of that was ultimately reversible because her cancer at that point was not really treatable. But, I think the way it was handled was, again, with the best of intentions, but ultimately not giving her family the clear information about what was reversible and what wasn't, and how we could really take the best care of her, knowing that things weren't reversible.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I wrote about a bit in my CPR piece that we have to think about what are we trying to reverse when we're doing CPR on somebody? The underlying cause has to be thought about very deeply. And that concept was not really a part of the family meetings that we had. And ultimately, before she developed this ascending paralysis, the way I communicated her was really through notes she would write. And that's how all of us communicated with her. And she eventually had to say no more. And the last sentence she wrote was, "I am ready to fly." And I will
Wow.
never forget that. And so in the end, as horrifying as being awake was, and that kind of augmented the distress of everybody involved, it was ultimately a gift that she could say or write that before her arms became paralyzed.
I want to have you explain, if it's even possible to explain this, why we're seeing this rise in cancers among young people. I think this would be shocking to a lot of listeners. It's certainly not something that I knew about until you and I started talking about it. So what do you know about that?
The jury's out.
That was a taste of my conversation with Dr. Sunita Puri, talking about her recent articles in The Atlantic and The Wall Street Journal. If you want to hear the rest, and I highly suggest you hear the rest, become a paying subscriber at meghandaum.substack.com. You can also just go to Substack and look up The Unspeakable. You should find it. This is how we're doing things now. The podcast is going to be less paywall than before, but paying subscribers get 2 entirely extra bonus episodes just for them every month. And this is one of them. You can also check out the podcast on YouTube at The Unspeakable with Meghan Daum on YouTube. We're doing stuff on video from now on, not this one, often not the bonus episodes, because I really think that, audio only is the best format for this, but, you got to get with the times. Anyway, it's a great time to become a paying subscriber. That's the point. So please do that. Additionally, I will see you next time. I will be back with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.